In this lecture, we are going to talk about a tricky feature called scope. Once in a while, you may encounter strange behavior from your variables that prevent you from accessing their value. Being aware of a variable's scope can prevent strange behavior from occurring. So, what am I talking about? Scope affects the accessibility of a variable in your application. You can think of it as an imaginary fence for your variables. The location of your variable definitions will affect how they can be used. If your variable is defined in a block of code, external code will not have access to the variable. Let's talk about scope with an analogy. My favorite analogy is the apple tree analogy. Let's pretend you have a beautiful apple tree in your backyard. It's surrounded by a large fence to prevent others from stealing your tree. If you invite a neighbor over, they'll have access to your apple tree. In this analogy, a variable is represented by a tree. Our fence is a function. Lastly, our neighbor can be code that needs access to the variable. Simple enough, right? Let's take it a step further. In this example, our neighbor is not inside our house. Therefore, they're not allowed to grab an apple from our tree. On the right side, if you were to run the code, you would receive an error. The variable is defined inside the function. The log method does not have access to the variable. In our final scenario, let's say the apple tree is outside our house. The apple tree is completely public. Both my neighbor and I have access to the apple tree. This includes anyone else within proximity of the apple tree. In our code example, the variable is defined outside the function. It's accessible inside and outside of the function. Scope applies to all blocks of code, such as functions, conditional statements, loops, etc. If you ever receive an undefined error from the console, you should always check the location of your variables. It may be nested inside a block of code. Fixing these types of errors is as simple as moving the variable above a level. There's a gotcha you can run into if you're not careful. The var keyword is more flexible than the const and let keywords. It does not abide by the same rules as the other keywords. For example, we can define a variable inside a conditional statement with the var keyword. This variable will be available outside of the block. This behavior is not true for the let and const keywords. However, variables always have a restricted scope if defined within a function. The second example would not work. It doesn't matter if you're using the var, const, or let keywords. One more thing. Throughout the course, you may hear the words local variable or global variable. A variable is considered local if its accessibility is restricted to a specific function or block of code. On the other hand, variables are considered global if they're accessible everywhere. At the end of the day, the scope will affect the way we write code. Throughout this course, I'll be sure to remind you of how it affects us.